I hope you all had a lovely lunch. And thank you for joining us again for this afternoon's plenary, the first plenary session, as there is one later. My name is still Brian Nisbet. I'm Service Operations Manager in HEAnet. And this session is, so unfortunately, this session was due to be Richard Brown, the Director of the NCSC, in person. Unfortunately, life happened, and he will be joining us remotely, which is still, thankfully, a thing that is much easier and we're all much more used to these days than we used to be. So the National Cybersecurity Centre, the NCSC, is a vital part of Ireland's cyber defences, and HEAnet are very happy and proud to be engaging with them on a number of different points and topics, and working with them to improve coordination, communication across the entire sector. And it's something that we're in regular conversation with them and will be hopefully increasing, as Richard will be talking about, into the next few years. So that's enough by me, and I think I will hand you over to Richard Brown, the Director of the NCSC. Thank you very much.
Good Lord. That's a worryingly large screen. Good afternoon, everybody. As Brian has said, and to slightly contradict him, life didn't happen, the PAC happened, which is the opposite of life for anybody who's ever been in front of the PAC. I have a short presentation, which I'll run through fairly quickly. This is going to be a deliberately scattergun approach to many things, cyber, including, but not limited to, how it's changed this state's role, perspective, meaning, purpose in technology. So, as Brian has said, the NCSC is part of the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment. We've been around since 2011. I'll come in a second to our roles and responsibilities, but first I'm going to give you a really brief history of technology, which I think everybody wants immediately after lunch on a Thursday afternoon in Killarney. The good news is I'm going to get into some details on European legislation in a while, but really is what you're all here for, we all live for. So very bluntly, the early internet, we think of the internet as being something that is world-changing and epoch-defining in its own right, and of course it is. But in many ways, it is really dependent on a few pieces of technology that go back more than 100 years. We always like to talk about telecoms, starting with telegraph cables, transatlantic telegraph cables. Of course, if you think back further, there's plenty of examples in revolutionary France and elsewhere of similar technology-based solutions, including flags and various different things. But let's start with this. The very first transatlantic cable was laid across the Atlantic and landed not far from where you're all sitting at the moment in Valentia Island. First letter was, profoundly geopolitically important statement of from the Queen at the time to the President of the United States. Now, while the cable broke, it really started a whole new perspective on humanity. Let's jump forward about 120 years to the late 1960s, early 1970s. This is a map of ARPANET as it stood in 1971. For those of you who are familiar with the US Defense Industrial Complex, it'll become immediately clear that most of the nodes on this are military establishments or military bases. Some, and you know who I'm talking to, are academic institutions. You'll see Stanford, you'll see MIT, you'll see a few others. But this is what the internet came from. It was a means of military and research institutions sharing information using a network that was essentially originally designed for secure military comms in the case of a disaster, usually involving nuclear weapons. So what does that mean for Ireland? Well, it has a series of very dramatic implications for Ireland. What it means is, first, starting from the early 1990s, what most people call the third phase of our economic miracle, we started moving towards digital economy firms. Before, the digital economy or the internet economy had become a really dramatically large thing. That early mover advantage means that today, 16 of the global top 20 tech firms are located here, have their European headquarters or other substantial headquarter functions. About 30% of all European data is held here. We have, for those of you who are familiar with cloud computing, we have a vast number of very large cloud computing centers. And critically, these 53 operational data centers, it's probably about 56 now, actually. These data centers are not just hosting inert data. If something happens to these centers, other countries, other governments, other people wouldn't just lose access to their email or to some numb data terminal. What they will lose is live services. They will lose entire software platforms. They will lose email systems. They will lose public transport fare cards. They will lose aspects of their financial services infrastructure. These cloud computing platforms are not just data stores. They're active, used every day by millions environments. Economically for us, there's 37,000 people employed in the digital sector in Ireland, about $35 billion worth of billion euro worth of exports. Sorry, I'm used to talking in America. So we end up in a situation where we've gone from being a peripheral island that was only centered in the world between the president and the Queen Victoria by our location to being a global digital hub. That has huge implications economically, which I'm sure are all familiar with, but it also has huge implications in terms of security. Before we dive into what that means for us, let's talk about the network itself first for a second. Cybersecurity, the internet, digital infrastructure is almost all privately owned. Okay, the state owns a vanishingly small amount of it. The state also cannot patrol, access, monitor that domain in the same way as it can, nominally at least, as the sea or the air or the land, because the infrastructure is privately owned and the communications, the traffic, the activity is encrypted and hidden deliberately. Similarly, there's a huge risk asymmetry because the responsibility for securing, monitoring, operating these networks lies with private individuals and private companies, but the impacts are societal. If we were to lose a cloud provider, if we were to lose a telecoms provider, in fact, if we were to lose the telecoms or SCADA systems underpinning the energy network, that would be a societal problem. We can all think about healthcare briefly and our experiences 2.5 years ago in that regard. So governments have to come up with a solution. In Europe, it's the NIS directive. We'll come back to that. However, that globalized infrastructure, that global privatized infrastructure, has a whole series of supply chain implications. It means that vulnerabilities are global, interconnected and interdependent. What does that mean in blunt terms? It means that if there's a vulnerability on a software platform that is used, developed by a provider anywhere in the world, and if that platform has a global presence, that vulnerability is immediately global. That means that you can go from having one minor problem in one office, in one city, anywhere in the world, for it to be a global challenge within an hour. Secondly, dependencies are often invisible until it's too late. So very often in cybersecurity, we spend a lot of our time managing invisible vulnerabilities that are maybe an hour, 6 hours, 12 hours away from exploitation. So we're forever chasing, finding, and trying to fix these dependencies, vulnerabilities live. But the dependencies, the linkages between systems, services, processes, and people are often invisible as well. So we don't know what's going to go wrong 6 steps down this dendritic tree, this collapsing tree, until someone pulls a pin out of it and the whole thing falls apart. So managing this stacked series of layered dependencies on a global level is a whole new challenge for humanity. Obviously, and thirdly, dependencies are often extraterritorial. So while we might be dealing with an issue here related to a particular vulnerability, it is a given that 100, 150, 200 other countries are dealing with other aspects of the same problem. That's fine when we talk about an active vulnerability or an active issue, but an incident, if something goes down, has a whole series of other implications. Because, and lastly, these dependencies can be a mix of physical, logical, and human. So one of the most obvious, real world, very dramatic things that can go wrong is if someone were to pull up a fiber. Now, we think at the moment of something dramatic happening out at sea, but the most important cybersecurity incidents we've had in terms of outages have been what we call the BYD problem, the big yellow digger. Someone pulls up a fiber, it pulls down a service, and then you have a series of cascading problems thereafter. It can be human. Someone can pull out a plug. There's some very dramatic examples in the aviation industry of where individuals, one person has pulled the plug out in a server room and taken down booking systems for entire international airlines. But it can be cyber, it can be human, it can be logical, it can be military. So we're in a very opaque, very complex space. And of course, the standards that underpin all of this are made and developed in ways that are extremely difficult to control, that are reliant and built for a different era in lots of different ways, and they're diverse. So I've just thrown up a mix there. First of all, you'll see examples of patents. That's a Mercedes patent from the late 19th century. On the top right, you'll see the ITU. That's the International Telecoms Union. That's the body that sets global telecom standards to this day, now under a UN function. But you look at the HEAnet question, the DNS system, the DNS, which runs the entire internet, the address book for the internet, that's run by a not-for-profit corporation based in California. It is a very simply, in a very straightforward way, a charity, basically. But it runs the infrastructure that the entire global economy is based upon. All of these things matter. The intellectual property that goes into the construction of software, the construction of hardware, the construction of services, the global international legal agreements that govern, at least to an extent, the functioning of the network, and also these very soft, very generic functions, standards, regulation-ish type bodies all matter. And they're all contested politically, geopolitically. They're all contested internally in terms of internal politics, internal commercial arguments. And we, as a species, more and more depend on all of this continuing to work. So what does that mean? Well, in the very first instance, and I stress in the first instance, it means the state can't protect itself in the same way as before. This infrastructure here are the equipment, in some cases, all the equipment that this state used to defend itself during the last major European confrontation in the 1940s, in the Second World War. We have land, we have sea cover in terms of aircraft, and we have tanks. You can't do that anymore. Okay, why does it matter? To Harris really quickly. Well, it matters because protecting our digital and energy infrastructure is vital for our economic interests, for the livelihoods, standards of living, the businesses of the 5.2 million people who live in this state. It's also important for our regional and global interests. For us to hold our head up as a member of the international community, to continue to act as a hub, as a locus for this economic activity, we have to be seen to and to actually protect this infrastructure, this services, and this data, or these data. But this is not a static question. It's extremely dynamic. So we have to be proactive. We have to be out there continually monitoring our environment, continually flexing our own ability to defend that environment, and continually looking ahead with partners globally to ensure that we're in the right place, that we're doing what we need to be doing. What that means then is that we need to have a very specific national approach to security, and particularly cybersecurity in this area. We can't let us slide us by or pass us by. So that brings us to us. So what do we do? Simply put, the mission of the NCSC is to lead the national response to cyber risk. Now, this is a vast field. Very bluntly, what we do is we do incident detection and response. That means we monitor, map, track incidents in the state, insofar as we can, and we'll come to that in a moment. We conduct a very large amount of risk analysis and situational awareness building within our own auspices, with our colleagues in the Defence Forces and the Gardaí, different aspects of both of those organisations. And we do a huge amount of work supporting other government departments and government risk assessments on what exact risks apply for the state as a consequence of changes in cybersecurity and technology risk more generally. So, for example, we deal with things like supply chain risks, the implications for telecom systems of certain providers being on certain parts of certain infrastructure. And then we provide support to regulators who go out and change that process. We also have a huge engagement function, part of the reason I'm here. We have a series of other actions in cyber resilience, and we have a new as of last year, capacity building function, which I'll come to. Subtext in all of this. Cybersecurity, the internet, is a confounding policy space. Cyber is in everything because every device, every system, every process we use is reliant on it. And everything is in cyber because it can be human, it can be logical, it can be software, it can be hardware, it can be geopolitical, it can be military. So we have to have this very large, very dynamic engagement process across government, right? Everything from people, friends in Department of Education, Department of Further Education and Reform, into our public expenditure and OGCIO, into defence, into foreign affairs, and so on. So we're in all of this. I spent last week in the United States with colleagues from Foreign Affairs and the Gardaí, attending a series of meetings on ransomware in the White House and meetings elsewhere on other security issues. This is part of our work. So team structure, really briefly, 3 directorates, a technology directorate, an operations directorate, and a resilience directorate. You can see the teams. I won't bore people with it. Resilience, this directorate has right now, today, these 6 teams that will change slightly. We have an engagement team who lead on a whole series of what we call whole series of engagement tasks. We use mechanisms called cores. It's important in this sector. Core, we're very innovative, stands for coordination and response. These are sectoral groups or committees that are chaired by a sectoral lead, which we use to deliver training, deliver briefing, deliver advice, guidance, and support, but also to listen and to learn from the individual sectors. The first one of these, GovCore, has been extant for 3 years more now. The second one, which we thought would be hilarious, we called Encore, is the energy one. We have further ones. DigiCore is now stood up and live, and we have further ones coming next year, including, we hope, budgets allowing, one in the academic space for third level institutions. The other is strategic risk management. That's about understanding and mapping global risks. For those of you who are particularly interested, you may have read the National Cyber Risk Assessment we published in June of this year, which called out a series of risks that we were mapping and monitoring, and then the further work we're planning on doing in those areas. This covered, very bluntly, AI, it covers HPC, high performance computing, and quantum, and it covers a series of other issues as well, particularly in the telecom space. Everything from the subsea to the terminal equipment, the SLTE equipment, right through to points of presence and the cloud basis of much future-facing telecoms infrastructure. And then a whole series of horizon scanning, which feeds into the national security picture at a national level. Certification and compliance are given. We'll touch on compliance in a moment again. Capacity building is important briefly in this sector because as of last year, we also hold the NCC function, so the National Coordination Centre for Cybersecurity R&D. We're at a very advanced stage now on a national cyber industrial strategy, which will essentially frame the next 3 to 5 years worth of government work in the area. Then we have an internal PMO as well, which is a given. Ops right now has these 5 teams in it. Each of these teams, for those of you familiar with civil service terminology, is led by a principal officer. The directors are surprisingly directors. The ops team, to break it down really quickly, and this is changing slightly, the security operations team do IR. They do incident response. That's the team that is constantly monitoring and tagging incidents as they come in, and then triaging them for further response, be it into the risk ops team or up into senior management in terms of the national incident response process. Risk ops is a TI and vulnerability management team, and right now it does aspects of active cyber defense, or ACD. We'll have a new ACD team stood up in the next couple of weeks. Come to that. Engineering is our support function for the moment. Security and liaison is our own internal security function, and also handles liaison with domestic and international intelligence partners. That's how we share sensitive information and how we properly understand the nature of the risks that we face as an organization and as a state. And then ACD, this is a new area in and of itself. We've been doing aspects of this for 5 years. This is really about mapping and monitoring vulnerabilities that are out there. So not incidents, not issues that are happening, but trying to understand where the risks and vulnerabilities are nationally and stopping them before they become an incident. So, I mean, give you a case in point. This year, we've stopped or intervened in 60 plus cases where there was an active exploit of a vulnerable system here, where a bad guy had hands on keyboards and was actively making their way across individual victims in the state. We have several hundred more cases where we've intervened before that occurred. But we can say with certainty we stopped at least 60 incidents this year. I know the actual number, but I won't go into it. And that covers that. So just really briefly, because this is a global issue, we're forever engaging with, through a variety of different means, international partners. So at the top of this table, you'll see our individual European groups we work and engage with. Really briefly, and I won't go through all of these. Cyclone is the European directors group that coordinates European level cybersecurity incident response. We do exercises twice, if not 3 times a year, particularly in the last couple of years for reasons that are very obvious. It's a non-EU process, but even though it's under an EU flag. The Commission don't have a vote. They can observe, but they're not actually part of the collective. It's chaired by the presidency, which means I'll be in the chair if I'm still here in 2.5 years' time. And it's run by the member states. It's not like the Commission aren't in the room. So this is full spectrum cybersecurity incident response. The other elements, the CSIRT network, quickly, is the operational level, the computer security incident response team level European coordination group. And that's the group by which one of the groups by which we share live threat intelligence and live incident reporting and response process material. It's a hugely important process at the moment, and it's based now finally on a really useful malware information sharing platform, or MISP, which allows us to share live malware. So we can share stuff that's actually materially useful. We've been doing that for some time. Left and right, US, UK is kind of obvious. We share a land border with the UK, and we have a particular interest in energy and telecoms and other infrastructure that spans the border. Below this, at national level, obviously you can see we have our closest partners will be in the Defence Forces and Gardaí. We have particularly close relationships with certain parts of academia for historical reasons. And then on the left of the screen, you'll see that we have a series of commercial relationships. Some of these are paid for, as in we have contracts with some of the larger threat intelligence providers. We also have MOU or other agreements with the likes of particularly Microsoft and AWS, where we have a formal binding agreement on the sharing of information in confidence, along with a lot of other bits and pieces as well. And below that, then we have our constituents. These are just the people to whom we provide services. They are, as you'll see, government, operators of essential services, digital service providers, businesses, citizens. But our focus for much of the last decade, for reasons entirely of resources, has been government and critical services. Because if something goes wrong with those, everybody's affected. And let's come to that in a moment. So these are just really briefly some of our tools. Much of the tools that we use is open source. You'll see the 7 little sigils on the bottom. Those are our own home-built tools. The one, Foxhound, it should be very obvious which one is Foxhound, is a full spectrum end-to-end cybersecurity incident response, management, triage, and reporting tool. One built tool to essentially automates the work of the CSIRT to a very substantial extent, and then monitors, tracks, and generates reports on all of the activity. It's the only reason we can do what we do with less than, well, with about 30 staff on the ops team. So it's a very substantial challenge, and that's the reason why we can do it. Okay, so really quickly to dive into what cyber is before we talk about the implication for your particular sector. We all have, whether we like it or not, literary, cinematic, or other reference points we use. We talk about or think about cybersecurity as a thing. I'm showing my age by that list there. Cyber is one of those things, because of its prominence in media, because of the way in which people tend to portray it in some cases, very often either overhyped or underrepresented in terms of what it actually means. So it's not this, I use this still from the Ingmar Bergman film, it's not playing chess with death. It's not really, or shouldn't be considered, an analog to nuclear weapons. Forgive the pun. It's not a tool or a system that is used once or not at all. Rather, it is, give you a case in point. People think of, in some cases, of these large-scale existential threats as being these binary things. It happens or it doesn't. Cybersecurity is the opposite of that. Cybersecurity is happening all of the time. Rather than being this cold, cynical, cerebral exercise of playing chess, it's a bar fight. There's incidents happening all of the time. Some of these incidents are extremely serious. They involve nation states, they involve large-scale criminal actors. Some of them are small-scale fraud. Some of them are not really incidents at all. And our role, or at least part of our role, is to understand which is which and to respond as appropriate, to ensure that the people who need to have the information, so people who need to have information on certain things get it, and that we can step in and respond where there is a pressing need from a state perspective to do so. What does it mean? Well, practically, and I'll talk about the risks to your sector in a moment. Cyber really allows people to do 3 things. It allows bad actors to do 3 things. It allows people to steal things, okay? That basically means espionage, but it could also mean commercial espionage. It could also mean ransomware, the first part of ransomware, stealing all of your data. It also allows people to compromise things. So this might well be compromising information, amending information. It could mean compromising a political process by leaking information, which goes back to the first one. And it can also mean slowing down, amending, or compromising a process that further has a series of implications down the line. That's a more highly evolved point, and let's talk about the electricity system at a different day. And lastly, and rarely, it allows people to break stuff. Kinetic damage by cyber means is possible. It's been done on a number of occasions, and we have to look at recent incidents in Ukraine to see that. But it's actually very rare. It's very difficult. It's much more difficult than people generally give credence for. And it's very rarely done for a whole lot of reasons. But the simple one is, if you use a cyber tool, very often that's it. It's done. Because once you've given away to the world how you do something, it's very easy to build a means of responding to it. The obvious example of this is, if you look in the immediate aftermath of the most recent Russian invasion of Ukraine, when they started to deploy the first in a series of what was ultimately 10 or 11 different variants of wipers, the Ukrainians very quickly understood what they were doing. And while the first one had some effect, thereafter it was not trivial, but relatively straightforward to stop that from happening again. So the effectiveness of those cyber tools diminished dramatically over time. So cyber is much more likely to be used in the shadows. It is much more likely to be used as a tool of statecraft, as a tool of espionage, as a tool of criminal actors, than it is to be something very dramatic and very spectacular. This is, I'll go through this really briefly. This is essentially the cybersecurity kill chain. These are the stages of a cyber attack. It's important for something I'll come to in a second. As you'll see, nearly every cyber attack, there are some variants on this, have to go through these 7 stages. Our role in the NCSC is to stop any of this from happening. But if it is to happen, stop it as early as possible in the kill chain to ensure that any damage that is done is minimal and is best and most easily recovered from. I'll explain that. So really quickly on national strategy. Every European country has to have a national cybersecurity strategy. We've had 2, 2015 and 2019. We've, as recently as July, published a midterm review of this, but this piece here remains pertinent. There's 3 aspects to national strategy. One is the protection piece, largely what we do, protecting the state by identifying risks, identifying incidents, stopping them, and building back better. Second piece is developing, and this is developing the capacity of the state, research institutions, of organizations like yours, to go out and understand how best to defend themselves. And the last piece is engagement. This goes back to the norm setting, the global standards, because we need to ensure that our perspective on this is fully heard, our views on this are fully heard at a European level, at a global level in the UN, groups like the OSCE, groups like the OECD, to ensure that our view of a free, open, peaceful, and secure cyberspace is reflected, and it's something that we can stand over into the future. So obviously there's inward and outward components of this in terms of how we behave ourselves here, how we ask and expect others to behave in cyberspace. One of the obvious ones here, and for any of you with interest in international law, a couple of weeks ago, we published, or the state published, its perspective on the application of international law in cyberspace, which feeds into a very large global process, which essentially sets out how we think international law should arrive or apply in cyberspace. It's very well done. I didn't write a word of it, so I can say that. Also might explain why it's very well done. Objectives, these are basically the objectives of the National Cybersecurity Strategy. I can answer any questions on any of these that people want, but not the crux of it. Really quickly, so probably the single most important legislative tool we have is the 2016 EU NIS Directive, or NIS 1 as we call it now. Really quickly, because NIS 2 is coming all of your way. The original NIS Directive was applied by states, so states had to apply it, but states got to choose who was in. So we, within the NCSC, went out and we chose in 2017, 2018, about 80 entities in the state who we felt met the requirements of being operators of essential services. And then we bound them to meet a whole series of security standards. This is the process. Transposing legislation was signed in September 2018, 18th of September 2018. There were 70 OAS designated up front. It's more than 100 now. And then guidance documents were provided over time. The security measures were delivered by us. They were published. They're still on the website. The most recent version is April 22, I think. It's based on a global standard, the NIST framework, and we audit against that on a regular basis. We're just finishing one audit with another one underway. That'll be our 4 for this year done. Then there's also a binding incident reporting threshold. So if you have an incident, you have 24 hours to report it. Using thresholds set by us, using a metric relevant to each individual sector or each individual OS. This goes back to the kill chain, and that's why I use the kill chain. The standard we use for security, the requirements we place on security are based on the NIST framework. And we've built this model premised on that to help people understand how better to manage the risks. This is a huge arcane subject matter in its own right, and I won't delve into it in any great detail, but very basically, we ask people to on the basis of the primary colors in the middle, they're not primary, but forgive me, to identify measures to identify their key infrastructure. What do you have on your IT system that matters? And then take the measures on the outer ring to deal with those, to manage those risks. We then ask people to identify measures to protect that infrastructure. In other words, to have a standard set of controls, risk controls, to manage those risks. Then we ask people to have a series of measures to detect an incident if it were to occur. And then respond to an incident if it does occur, and then recover from an incident if you happen to have one. So what we're seeking to do here, very bluntly, is to ensure that the risk of an incident occurring at all is as less as possible, as little as possible, to ensure that if you do have an incident, that it is a small incident or an incident that is easy to recover from. That if you do have a serious incident, that you're in a position where you can recover from it. This is all about driving down the risk to key services that the state, people, citizens, and customers, if you want, rely upon. That's NIS 1. Post NIS 1, all of this happened. I won't go into the detail, but we've had the cyber diplomacy toolbox, the electronic communications code, which is a huge piece of work, the 5G toolbox, which we've implemented, the EU Cybersecurity Act, which we're implementing, EU NCC regulation, which we're implementing. We also have 2 other pieces of legislation that are still in the books now, one being the Cyber Resilience Act, or CRA, the other one being the Cyber Solidarity Act, or CSA. They're not on the books yet, but they're being negotiated. But in between all of this, we've had this land. This is the NIS 2 directive. So NIS 2 was signed into law this time last year, December of last year, and comes into effect in October of next year. What it does, well, it does a lot actually. So we have an increase in sectors, I'll go through those in a second, and a dramatic increase in the number of entities. The state has also lost its ability or its right to select what it thinks matters. The directive is far more explicit and, in fact, obliges you to include certain sectors. We also have new incident notification guidelines and then extra requirements in terms of what people actually do. For those of you who are, well, everybody should be interested. If you go to our website, ncsc.gov.ie, we have a full infographic. It's long, it's detailed, and many of the graphics you're about to see are drawn from it. But it sets out in great detail what this actually means. The obligations for individual organizations and the obligations on the state. 3 pillars, and I'll focus on one of them. There's responsibilities on the member state, and most of that is coming to us. There's responsibilities on organizations, and there's responsibilities on information exchange and cooperation across Europe. Middle one, really quickly. First of all, and I'll have a specific slide on it, we have new accountability measures for top management for non-compliance with the terms of the directive. Secondly, we have a whole new range of essential and important companies that are required to take a whole new set of security measures and a very complex new incident reporting process. So very bluntly and really simply, the directive is cut into has 2 annexes. Annex 1 entities, these entities are known as essential entities. And these entities are bound to take ex-ante security measures. In other words, we are bound, or someone will be bound, come to that, to regulate these entities for their security. There will be a security process, and then there'll be audits. So there will be an ex-ante upfront engagement with all of these entities. You'll note that in there is public administration down on the bottom left. Let's come back to that. Also, just really quickly, you'll note that this digital infrastructure piece, including ISP and cloud, that is a European level piece. So in other words, this state, a regulator in this state, hopefully not us, will be regulating on a European basis cloud infrastructure. There's one large cloud infrastructure provider that doesn't have its European headquarters here, AWS, but most of the rest do, which means that we will be taking on under NIS 2 as a state a dramatic and very significant responsibility in cybersecurity. Again, Annex 2 is probably more pertinent, briefly. Annex 2 is an ex post requirement. These are entities that are required to take measures, but they won't be regulated up front. They'll only be regulated if there's an issue, if there's an incident. And then a national competent authority, somebody, will have the responsibility to come along afterwards and make sure that the appropriate measures were in place, and if not, to ensure that they are put in place after the fact. This is very broad, very bluntly, because it covers areas like food production and distribution. So it covers a broad swath of the agri-food sector. It covers a very large number of different areas within manufacturing. The directive was in greater detail, including parts of the chemical industry, the pharma industry, and so on. The eagle-eyed among you will have spotted the research piece in there in the middle. Let's come back to that. So this is basically a brief outline of what individual entities are required to do. You'll note that some elements of this, however, are common. So, for example, there is a requirement in both cases for security scans to be conducted. There's a requirement in both cases for incident reports to be provided. There's a requirement in both cases for, it's not down on this diagram in great detail, but your IP address range to be provided to the NCSC. So no matter what side of this you fall on, there's going to be obligations. Lastly, this is really important in this one, you can take a risk-based approach. So if your organization is not very heavily reliant on IT, then you can prioritize your compliance on that basis. And the competent authority can do the same thing. Essentially what that means is not everybody will be held to the same standard. If you're providing critical healthcare components and you are heavily reliant on IT, then you're just take it as a given, you're at the higher level. But if you're manufacturing agricultural machinery and you're only partially reliant on IT, then you're less likely to be in that situation. So research organization, you'll see that it doesn't mean higher education. It means an entity which has as its primary goal Article 6.41. That 41 is the Article 6 is the definition section. So in other words, it doesn't include education institutions. That's the good news. This is the bad news. Article 2.5 of the directive points out that member states may provide for this directive to apply to public administration entities at a local level, including educational institutions, and in particular where they carry out critical research activities. What that means is the state has a choice to make. Actually has several choices to make. Come to that in a second. Management responsibility, I'll rehearse this because it's useful for lots of people in this space to carry in their back pocket when they're talking to their senior management about budgets. Once NIS 2 comes into effect in October 18th of next year, senior management bodies of essential and important entities, both types, not just the essential ones, have to sign off on the adequacy of their cybersecurity risk management measures. This is no longer something that can be devolved to an IT manager or a CISO. This is something that will legally be obliged of senior managements of organizations. So this is no longer something where senior management can claim to not know or senior management can avoid. It is on everybody's radar whether you like it or not. It comes into effect on the 18th of October. The next steps. Two things have to happen in the short term. The first one is that the state needs to make a decision, and there'll be a government decision on this in the next couple of weeks, on who the competent authorities are in respect of each of the sectors. So there's 2 years worth of work done on that and complete. We have a very good idea of who's doing what. That'll become public hopefully in about 3 weeks. The second choice is this piece, trying to work out what the state should do in respect of these areas. So right now, today, we can't say with certainty that, keep in mind, public administration is in the essential entities, not the important, so the higher level one. But the state has a choice to make as to what goes into this area. So we have to go through a process, which is obviously already started, on deciding what public administration entities are in at a local level, local authorities, whatever that might be, and educational institutions. Obviously, because it needs a government decision and it's premature to even really speculate, but I would not take it as a given this won't happen. And I would particularly be interested in, I'd be particularly curious to hear people's perspectives on incident reporting, because no matter what happens in all of this, the NCSC position will be that we need to see incident reports from this sector. Third level sector, in some ways, has gotten off relatively lightly from cybersecurity incidents. We've had some very public ones and some that are not public. But in general terms, and looking at colleagues across the rest of Europe and in the US, we've gotten off relatively lightly. There's two particular risks for this sector. One is very public, ransomware. We've had some already, obviously, but generally speaking, we've been lucky. The other one is not public and has never really been made public in this state, and that's espionage. Universities, or research institutions in universities, very often hold research information, new IP in some cases, that is extremely valuable to third parties, be they governments or other parties. There is an ongoing, significant, high risk of espionage activities facing universities. This is where we come in. We've dealt with some of this in the past. in this sector specifically, and we'll deal with more. So my parting point here is expect to hear more about this, but also if you have an incident, if you something you can't understand, come and talk to us. It's very easy to find us when you need to. And secondly, of course, very often we come to you, and when we do, please talk to us, because it's a lot easier to do it like that than to bring the cards in. And that's it. That's what I got.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. I think lots for everybody to think about there. So we do have some time for Q&A, and again, Slido is open for people, or people can step up to the mics, which I believe are in the back of the room. Very bright lights. But while people are maybe typing some things into Slido, just one question, Richard, for you. If somebody picks up the phone, if a university or an institution picks up the phone because they've had an incident and rings the NCSC, what should they expect to happen next?
It depends entirely on the nature of the incident. So if your incident is a ransomware issue or a precursor to ransomware, you can expect a very rapid response. Very often what we do is put boots on the ground. So you'll get a couple of very world-weary cybersecurity specialists arriving into your door who will look for things like logs, PCAPs in some cases, and we'll be looking for IOCs. Because very often what we're doing in an incident response process, while we are trying to protect and mitigate the incident that has occurred, we're also trying to ensure that other parties, nationally and internationally, are protected against that same incident. So very often we're looking for IOCs, indicators of compromise, be they IP addresses or file hashes or something else that allows us to identify the bad guy and then protect other people against the same thing. We can also do a lot on government networks to ensure that we don't have the same problem in government. So that's what you're going to expect. If it's another issue, if it's an espionage or other type issue, you can expect a different response. It will be slower, and it will involve, again, somebody probably coming on site, having a series of polite conversations. Some of those conversations may not be able to be had in your building. You may have to come into us. But that's thankfully relatively rare.
Okay. No one has we have Richard here. See, in living color. And I suppose one of the things, and you talked through a lot of the timelines for NIS2, but with October, are there any ideas of timelines on when the state will answer the questions that you pose there, or indeed when there'll be more awareness on who will be either important or essential?
Yeah, that is the question. So unfortunately, given previous experience with NIS1, I can be clear on some of that stuff, but not on all of it. The decision on who the competent authorities will be taken very soon. So that's live issue right now. The question of what's in and what's not might actually not happen until after October 17th of next year. So basically, this gets into legislative processes, but first of all, the transposing legislation has to happen. That's going to be primary legislation. In other words, it has to go, a full act has to go through the Oireachtas. That's not a simple process. And anything we do under the auspices of that act have to wait until after the act is signed into law by the President. So we could actually find ourselves in a situation where, while we're ready to go, we still have a statutory process to do after the legislation is signed.
Okay. And so at that point, one would hope that institutions shouldn't be expecting whoever the competent authority is at that point in time to be knocking on their door on the 1st of November going,
just on that really quickly, we've been doing competent authority work here for 5 years, so we have a lot of experience in doing exactly this. Our approach has always been to build to compliance. In other words, you can't expect people to be ready the day the legislation comes into effect. You have to be ready to do this progressively and over time, keeping in mind that there will be organizations that will lag and they'll need a little bit of assistance, politely, to get up to speed, and there'll be organizations that will be slower to do so. They won't need as much help, and they'll be best in class very quickly. We've also made a habit of, and we will be continuing to do so, to be very transparent up front on timing, and to be particularly transparent in terms of what will be required of people. So we've started a process now on designing the next generation of security measures for NIS2. Anybody who's interested can look. Our existing NIS1 compliance measures are up on our website. They're there to be seen. The new ones will be built on those to some extent. So anybody looking for a head up or a legs up can look at that. Beyond that, we will be going for public consultation on a draft of the next one in the middle part of next year. So by the end of Q2 of next year, we'll have our draft NIS2 compliance measures out for public consultation.
Okay. Well, listen, I think at this point in time, thank you very much. I think it's been very interesting and enlightening. There's lots more to find out about, and indeed, I suspect that various HEAnet staff members will be talking to your teams at various points, and indeed working to help the sector with all sorts of cybersecurity matters. So, Richard, just thank you again very much for your time today. Sorry you can't enjoy the hospitality down in Killarney.
I'm sorry, I'm not there. Thanks, Brian.
So before you all rush away, and we have a session break now, and we'll be coming back at 3 o'clock, we just want to do a quick Slido poll. So if you can log on to Slido if you haven't already. So a quick Slido poll just on cybersecurity matters as a broad piece of what's the market research almost. So if you can take it out there, I think the poll should be live at this point. If someone's giving me a thumbs up, I cannot see them. So, okay, cool. So yes, the poll is live there. So if you're happy to log in to Slido and just answer the 4 questions that are there. I will stand here awkwardly for a while you do so. And yes, sorry, it's. I think we're bringing it up there. Yes, thank you. If we can bring that up on the screen. Yay! So you've got cyber.com there and the HEAnet 2023. That yes number keeps on going, no. It's always the interesting thing of watching live polls. I'm sure there's academic papers written about whether people react to what they're seeing other people say on the polls. Do I want to be like the yes people or the no people? Cool. And I think we've... and one more there. I feel like I should be doing horse race commentary on this as well, Security did well, but I think ransomware takes the cup, no question whatsoever. Listen, folks, that's really useful information. Thank you very much. I think they're still live, so you can fill them in. But I won't keep you any longer. As I said, there's a session break now, and we recommence in parallel sessions at 3 o'clock. Thank you all very much.